Okay, welcome to my latest video. This is my 1994 Ferrari 348. 5 years ago I did a major on it with the timing belt change and all that stuff. You've probably maybe seen the videos on that. So since it's been 5 years, the general consensus is it's about time to redo the timing belt. So this time I'm going to do a video on what's involved dropping the engine out the bottom of this thing, and we will go from there. Okay, step one is disconnect the battery, which on my car there's a little twist knob down here that I just twist and it goes off. I know some of the other cars have batteries in the back and I don't know what's involved there, but for this one, just turn the knob there. Okay, next comes the engine lid, which is just held on by 4 10mm bolts. I put a little piece of blue tape up where the fitting meets the lid so that when it comes time to put it back on, I can at least have an approximate idea where it's supposed to line up. Okay, now next the rear wheels come off. I'm actually doing my car on a 4-post lift, so I'm going to be rolling the car back and forth. So when I take the wheels off, and remember you jack from the jack point, which is just below the back edge of the door. It's much farther forward than you think it's going to be. So here's your jack point, and after I get the rear wheels off, I'm going to put a little trolley under the jack point, and it's got 4 parallel wheels, and that way I can roll the car up and back on the 4-post lift without it falling off. And the other key thing is when you put your jacks or trolley or whatever under that the jack point there, it's got to be very far forward. If it hangs back behind the jack point much, it's going to interfere with dropping the pans and all the other stuff having to do with the engine. So it all has to be at that point or forward. Okay, so since I'm jacking it from, or I'm going to put the trolley under the jack point, I actually can't put the jack there. So I put a jack forward of the jack point, and I also put a second jack back under the subframe, so I didn't put too much load over here, which isn't technically a jack point. And I boosted both jacks up, and now I have the rear wheel off, and I can just pop the wheel off and then put the trolley underneath. So now the wheel can come off. Okay, so the wheels are off and she's sitting on her trolleys, and now you start to do all the 8,000 screws for the fender liners. I did label, there's 3 of them, so I labeled a right rear, right top, and right front, and I'll just pop a couple of these things out. Right bottom's out. And there's a couple screws up under. comes out. And 2 more screws up top. Okay, and the right top comes out. And then we have engine. How about that? Because the jack point, the rear jack point, is so far forward, up under the door, it always creeps me out a little bit that you have so much weight hanging off the back and not much on the front. So one of the things I do is put a couple buckets or tubs of water up in the front trunk to try and give it a little weight up at the front. Now the thing I do that you don't really have to do is I pull the rear bumper off just so I don't scratch it up or anything. I don't think you actually have to do that necessarily to pull the engine out, but I also put fender covers on, and now it's time to remove the heat shields for the exhaust, and they're just a bunch of 10mm nuts. Okay, next I'm going to take off the airbox, which has got 2 little bitty flathead screws, one there, and then another 2 for the other that hook it into the mass airflow sensor. So take the little bitty screws out, then you have a couple 10mm nuts, and then you have to loosen the hose clamps on the 2 hoses that sneak in the bottom. And you're pretty much done. Like I said, little bitty screws. Lifts up and pulls out. That's that. Okay, now that the airbox is out, I'm going to pull the exhaust system off. You can see the oil filter there, and below the oil filter is where the oxygen sensors plug in. So you're going to pull up the wires on the little plugs and then unplug them. And then all that's left is 2 bolts for the flange on each side, there and down there, and then you have the actual carriers here, again, one on each side, and you can either unbolt them up here or unbolt these, and then the whole thing comes out. So now it's time to start stripping away the access panels underneath the car. Before I go any further though, I'll mention that I siphoned most of the gas out of the gas tank, again just to try and decrease the weight in the back of the car and increase the weight in the front. So these are all 10 millimeter bolts except for the two at the very front are 8 millimeter. Okay, that should do it. Nope, one more. Okay, that one's done. Okay, next comes the panel that lies under the gas tank. The only thing of importance here is the 10 millimeter nut here that's covered by the handbrake cable. You actually only have to loosen that nut just a little bit because instead of there being a hole in the panel, there's a slot. So once you loosen that up a little bit, you can just slide the whole thing out. You don't have to actually take the nut out because it is definitely trapped by the handbrake cable. These are again 10 millimeters. Actually, they're Phillips head screw kind of things. Left side radiator, and down at the bottom there is a little slotted plug, and we will see if we can loosen that up and get some coolant out of here. Okay, now to the right side of the car, or the starboard side. Um, Here you've got two different radiator things. The lower one is the oil cooler. Upper one is the actual water radiator. So once again, there is the little plug that we will unscrew to drain the radiator over here. Okay, second one done. Okay, now it's time to drain some engine oil. Gas tank is overhead. We're looking back. This is the front of the crankcase. There's a bolt back here. That is not the oil drain plug. That is some special adjustment for oil pressure or something. The drain plug is up at the front, up here. And you need a pretty damn big Allen wrench to do this. I'm sure this is going to be messy as hell. Yeah, not bad. More controlled than I expected it to be. Okay, so that's part one of engine oil removal. And part two of draining the oil is the tank at the right back of the engine compartment. Big nut on the bottom. I have a 7/8 inch socket. So I don't know what that translates to millimeters, but it seems to fit fine. So we will loosen it up. And then catch some oil. Okay, oil is draining out. Okay, next thing to do is disconnect the shift linkage cables. And that's pretty easy to do. There is a plate to remove, and you basically got 1, 2, 3. Well, you got a nut here, 10 millimeter, and be careful and examine how this all fits together. It's a little mustache piece with a ridge that fits into a slot there, and these fit into a slot on the overhead piece, so it pinches it all together and it keeps it at the exact length. And if you don't get it right, then your shifting will be all screwed up. And these are also 10 millimeter, but it's a nut and a bolt. So you'll need to put a wrench up on the upper nut to hold it. And then it'll come apart. And just pop it out. And there's your nut and bolt. And now you have a loose clevis pin on this side, or clevis fork. And now we do the other one. And pop that nut and bolt out. And they are free. And now you can pull the cables out of the you pull them down out of the groove and then pull them out of the little plastic box they're in. Okay, shift cables are done. Okay, as far as the shift cables go, if you've never lubricated your shift cables, I highly recommend it. You may notice that it makes a huge difference in your shifting. I did a video on lubing them. Just look it up, Ferrari 348 shift cable lubrication. Next we'll disconnect, or I've already disconnected, the line from going to the rear brakes. You probably can't see it very well, but here's the brake line, and it's an 11 millimeter nut that came out of here, and I've screwed it into a piece of PVC plastic that I drilled a hole in and trapped it with a metric 10x1 tap, and that way I could screw it in and stop it from dripping brake fluid all over the place. So it's oh, there it is moving. So that's the brake line screwed into the piece of PVC, and the brake line is disconnected. Okay, we're back to the dry sump tank behind the right rear wheel again. We already drained oil out of the bottom plug. Now we have to disconnect the oil hose. This thing is a monster-sized nut, and I'm sure there's probably a official Ferrari factory wrench 800,000 millimeters, but I don't have that, so I'm just going to use channel locks and loosen it up and disconnect it. Okay, that's that. Okay, so we have one more oil pipe to disconnect. That's the one going to the oil cooler, which sits right below the right-hand radiator. Now I'd like to say that I just put the wrench on this and it popped right off, but actually it was an absolute bear. It was very tight. I don't know why. I actually had to cut out and weld up my own wrench because it is a huge nut, and finally I was able to coax it off, but it was not a happy camper. Okay, over by the left side or port side of the car, by the shock tower, is the connector for the hydraulic line going to the clutch. It's just two lines, kind of like brake lines, except the fittings are bigger, going into this block. And with a 13mm wrench, you can unscrew the one fitting. And what I did was, after I pulled it out of the block, is I had a rubber cork that I drilled out, and I tapped it with, I think it was a 1/2 inch by 20 tap, some threads, and then I just screwed it onto the end of the fitting here to try and block the line up so it doesn't drip brake fluid continuously while the engine's out of the car. And right above that is a plug, and just pop it up and unplug that. So that is done. Okay, back behind the right-hand side, or starboard shock tower, we have this connector for wires from the battery. These are 13mm nuts. Okay, there's one side, and there's the other side, and then there is this nut down here that holds something called the P-clip, and that's a 10mm. Just pop that off. And pull that away from there. Put the nut back on. Okay, back behind the left rear wheel, there is a bolt that connects a ground strap to part of the frame that's going to be staying in the car. So that's a 13mm. Okay, so ground strap is off. Okay, in front of the left wheel, you'll find the handbrake connector, and that needs to come off because we're going to be dropping the engine here. There is a spring that will have to come off somehow. And then there's two 13mm nuts that will need to be disconnected. So let me struggle with this for a second. Okay, after much huffing and puffing, I got the spring out of the clip there, and then it just slides out on that side. It's not a very big spring, but it's stronger than you think it's going to be. Okay, and then I realized my handbrake was still on, so handbrake's off, makes life much easier. Okay, nuts off. Plastic piece comes off. Then you have another nut that has to come off. And then the cable goes through a clip here, and we'll have to disconnect that. And that just pokes through the little bracket there. Okay, so handbrake cable is out of the way now. Okay, now comes fuel filters, and I can't really film me breaking these things loose without smashing the camera. Basically, the upper nut is a 19, so you stick a 19 to hold it steady, and the spinny nut is a 17. And once you do that, then you can, once you break them, you can just unscrew the 17 and disconnect that, and be prepared for gas to fly everywhere. Okay, then you have to do the same thing for the top fitting, since we're going to be replacing the fuel filters anyway. Just to be funny, they, at least on this one, even though the lower fixed nut was a 19, up on top here it's an 18. So you have a 17 spin, and the fixed one is an 18. But more gas. So what I found is when you disconnect the bottom one, you get a little bit of gas that comes out, but not as much as you expect. But keep your pan under it, because then when you disconnect the top one, the suction's gone and all the fuel from the fuel filter comes draining out. So have your pan ready. And obviously you need to do the fuel filter on the other side, same way. Now we're still here on the left-hand port side of the car. And if you look up under the fender, you will find this wire coming up to this plug. This is the ABS connector. It's a coaxial cable, so you need to disconnect the ABS thing. It's got a little sensor that says SX on it for some reason, or XS, one of the two. So that gets disconnected. Just a little squeeze clip on one side, and just pull it apart, and you'll get the two ends of the cable. Okay, now the tank. This is actually going to stay with the car, so you have to disconnect hoses that are going between it and the engine. So there's one at the bottom of the tank. And the overflow pipe and it's bolted up to the shock tower cover here, which is going to stay with the car, but back behind it, it's also bolted to the frame that's going to drop down. So down in the hole there, you need to loosen that bolt, and if you come at it from underneath, you can see it's the nut right here. So unscrew that, and then it can disconnect. I've already done the fuel filter on this side and the connector for the ABS signal. Okay, next we're looking at the front of the engine, and tucked way up under there you can see the end of my wrench. I'll wiggle the wrench. It's on a 19mm nut, which is the fuel return hose. This hose right here is it. Goes down 90-degree fitting, and then it attaches to the engine here. So this needs to be undone, and when it does, lots of fuel come pouring out. So we will take care of that. Okay, so hose is disconnected. I'm going to stick it up here so it doesn't gush everywhere. Okay, at the back of the plenum is a little thing sticking up. That's the throttle cable, and it's an 8mm nut that you need to loosen up and take off. Okay, nut is off, throttle cable is out. But then up at the front of in front of the plenum, there's somewhere up there. Ooh. Okay, you can see the throttle cable, and it needs to be disconnected right there. So we will take care of that too. Okay, next you have to disconnect, or you have to undo or loosen up the hose clamps for the water hoses going between the pipes here. There's an upper and a lower, and the engine. There's two small ones that size, one up there and one under there, and then there's two big ones. They say you don't actually have to disconnect the hoses. As you drop the engine, the hoses will disconnect themselves, but you do have to loosen up the hose clamps. I have to remove the panel behind the seats to get to the ECUs, and I don't know how different it is on the different models, but on the convertible you have these little things you flip 90 degrees and they unsnap. Okay, and then once you lift the panel away, you've got an ECU here and a ECU up there, one behind each seat. So there's a couple connectors that you have to disconnect. That one. There's one to the magic button. And then there's a little metal lever here that you pry the lever up, and that will unplug the big plug to the computer, and you're done. So these parts are going to have to be stuffed through the hole in the bulkhead and out into the engine compartment, which is a bit of a pain in the neck to do. And an even bigger pain in the neck is trying to pull them back in again when you put the engine back in. But that's what you do. So here's my car up on the 4-post lift, and I think I've disconnected everything. So I'm going to start rolling it back until the rear end hangs off the back end of the lift. So you get the general idea. I do have a strap running from the top of the lift down to a eye bolt in the wall, just to make sure the whole thing doesn't go flipping backwards. I have the water in the front, an extra weight in the front, and we'll see how this goes. Technically, you're supposed to evacuate the Freon and drop the compressor with the engine, but last time I did this, I actually kept the compressor attached to the hoses and managed to drop the engine, leaving the compressor attached. So I'm going to try and do that again, although it seems a little challenging this time. There's a couple bolts holding the compressor to the engine block. Then there's a couple bolts holding the adjuster up there. There's the wire that you have to unplug. And then over top of the compressor there's this bracket, and there's 3 bolts holding it to the front of the engine, so that has to come out too. So we'll see. I'll try a little side shot. Yeah, we'll see how that works. Now there are the bolts at the front of the subframe that go into the bulkhead behind the seats. There's 6 on each side, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's 2 in front of the compressor, and same thing over there. So I've loosened those up a little bit, and then down in the back There is a big bolt there, and a big bolt here. So that and that will come apart. And then on the shock towers, the 4 bolts right next to the shocks are for the shocks, but the 2 outer bolts will need to be undone. So it'll be the 2 bolts there, 2 bolts down back, and 6 bolts there and 6 bolts there, and then it should drop out while feeding the wiring harness from the computers through the hole and trying to watch the air conditioning compressor. Should be fun. I should also point out that I took out the fuel filter on this side just to try and give me a little bit more room for the compressor when I try and pull this off. Continuing to ease it on down the line here. Almost there. Okay, so the butt of my car is hanging out in space, and I have my cart right up underneath the engine cage, so all I have to do is drop the lift about a half an inch and it'll be sitting on that. Okay, so it's now resting on the trolley. Now all I have to do is unbolt all the bolts that I already loosened up. So I'll do the ones in the rear here. I think these are like 22 millimeter nuts and bolts. They are big suckers. Okay, another mega one, and now we'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now for the ones on the shock towers, 13 millimeters. Okay, and I'll do the other side. Okay, so all the bolts are out now, so we will give a gentle lift to the car body and see if the engine stays in place and the car comes up. Okay, the water hoses are unhooking and spilling coolant onto the garage floor. Okay. You can see how the coolant hoses have pulled away from the pipe, so that's all going okay. Do check and make sure everything's disconnected as you maneuver, because I had forgotten on the charcoal canister there's two hoses that lead to the intake plenums, the front of them, and those need to be disconnected. And then there's two wires with two plugs, so hoses and wire plugs, so that needed to be disconnected, so that's done. It gets kind of crowded in here, but as you're lifting the car and leaving the engine behind, continue working on coaxing the ECU plug out through the rear bulkhead, and the engine compartment, you'll see it coming out just above the gas tank, and eventually, hey, the plug is out. Okay, now let me get the other side. I now have a big gaping hole where my engine used to be. I did put some jack stands underneath, now that it's going to be here for a while I work on the engine, just to take the load off the little trolley things. But managed to trolley it up and trolley it back using a come-along to pull it back and forth. One thing of note is on the left side of the engine, the clutch line, I disconnected it forward when really you want to disconnect it in the back. Now my forward one was easier to disconnect, so I disconnected it there and then I unscrewed the block from the frame. But if you just disconnect it forward and you don't unscrew the block from the frame, you'll be pulling on your pipe here. The only other thing I have to mention is when you pull this engine out, for some reason it expands. I mean, the engine appears bigger than the car. The thing is just huge once you pull it out. But that's how you pull the engine out. Putting it back obviously is a reverse of all of the above. The only thing is trying to get some of those bolts threaded in their proper holes is a pain in the butt. You know, I've read where people say, oh, I can pull the engine on these things, you know, in a couple hours and put it back in. I just cannot believe it. I find trying to get those bolts rethreaded, just the screws to put the fender liners in, trying to get the holes lined up and get them back in, yeah, it takes a while. So that's engine pulling. And I'll just briefly mention, I did get the engine out without disconnecting the AC compressor, and there's the engine. The secret behind it is the big oil pipe that goes into the block. If you unscrew that, it takes a 1 1/4 inch socket, which is pretty darn big, and then you pull that out of the way, and then you can get the compressor tied to the car and pull the rest of the engine away without any problems. My AC compressor there hanging from its wires and strings where I left it in place. But my point of this shot is you can see the milk bottle up above it with the gas in it, and what I found is as the temperature ambient temperature warmed up, it must have increased the pressure in the gas tank, and fuel started squirting out one of the fuel hoses that I disconnected from the engine. The cure for that is opening up the gas cap. So my advice is, when you start doing this, crack open your gas cap just to stop pressure from building up and fuel squirting out when you're not expecting it to do so.